For 10 years, I thought my parents died in a crash, until a letter from my dead mother revealed the truth and led me to the father who had searched for me all along. Last week, a letter arrived in my mailbox. The handwriting looked like something from a dream, a script I hadn't seen since I was 6 years old. It was my mother's. She was supposed to have died in a car crash 10 years ago, along with my father. The letter was brief. It said I needed to talk to my father, who was alive and had been searching for me all this time. There was a phone number at the bottom, and a single line about him never giving up. I held the letter for hours, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of it. My entire life, I believed I was an orphan. Now, this letter was tearing that apart. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring at the paper, wondering what I was supposed to do next. When I was 6, everything I knew about my life collapsed. I was told my parents died in a car crash on a highway. The details were vague, just that it was sudden and there were no survivors. I didn't see their bodies or attend a funeral. One day, I was living with my parents in our small house with the blue shutters. The next, I was packed up and sent to live with my aunt and uncle in a town 3 hours away. They were distant relatives, people I'd met maybe once or twice at a family gathering. Their house was big but empty, with bare walls and furniture that looked like it hadn't been moved in decades. I was given a room upstairs, a small space with a single bed and a desk. My belongings fit into one suitcase. Nobody explained much. My aunt handed me a schedule for school and chores, and that was it. I was expected to fit into their lives like I'd always been there. The first few weeks were a blur. I kept expecting someone to show up, maybe a grandparent or another relative, to check on me. Nobody came. My aunt and uncle didn't talk about my parents. If I brought them up, my aunt would change the subject, and my uncle would leave the room. I learned quickly to stop asking. Birthdays passed without cards or calls from anyone outside the house. Holidays were quiet, just the 3 of us eating dinner in silence. I started to feel like I'd been erased from whatever family I'd had before. School was the only place I felt halfway normal. I made a few friends, but I never invited them over. My aunt and uncle didn't like visitors. I grew up believing I was alone in the world, with no one left who cared about me. The memories of my parents started to fade, like they were people I'd only read about in a book. My aunt and uncle weren't cruel, but they weren't warm either. They provided food, clothes, and a roof, but that was where it ended. I was never treated like their child. They had no kids of their own, and I think they saw me as an obligation, something they had to deal with because nobody else would. Their house ran on routine. Breakfast at 7 o'clock, school, chores, dinner at 6:30, bed by 9 o'clock. If I stepped out of line, my aunt would give me a look that made me feel like I'd committed a crime. My uncle barely spoke to me. He spent most of his time in the garage, working on old radios he never seemed to finish. I don't think they hated me, but they didn't want me there. I felt it every day. When I tried to ask about my parents, I got nowhere. Once, when I was 8, I asked my aunt if she had any pictures of them. She said they were lost in a move. Another time, I asked my uncle what my dad was like. He grunted and told me to stop living in the past. By the time I was 10, I'd stopped trying. The lack of answers made me feel like I was chasing ghosts. I didn't even have a clear memory of what my parents looked like anymore. I had one photo, a blurry snapshot of me with a woman I assumed was my mom, but it was so worn I could barely make out her face. I kept it hidden in my sock drawer, afraid my aunt would take it if she found it. As I got older, the questions didn't go away, but I buried them. I focused on school and started working weekends at a local diner when I was 15. The job gave me a reason to be out of the house. I saved every penny, dreaming of leaving as soon as I turned 18. My aunt and uncle didn't care what I did as long as I followed their rules. I wasn't their responsibility in their eyes, just a temporary burden. I started to wonder if everything I'd been told about my parents was true. The story of the crash never added up. No funeral, no paperwork, no relatives ever mentioning it. It felt like a hole in my life, and the more I thought about it, the bigger that hole got. I didn't know what to do with those doubts, so I pushed them down and kept moving forward, telling myself I'd figure it out someday. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. I found it in the mailbox after work, tucked between bills and junk mail. The envelope was plain, no return address, just my name written in that familiar handwriting. I recognized it instantly, even though I hadn't seen it in a decade. It was my mother's. My hands shook as I opened it. The letter was short, written on a single sheet of paper. It mentioned things only my mom would know, the lullaby she sang to me as a kid, the way I used to hide crackers under my pillow, the stuffed bear I carried everywhere. It said I needed to call my father, that he was alive and had been looking for me for years. At the bottom was a phone number and one sentence: "He's never stopped looking." I read it a dozen times, trying to process it. My parents were supposed to be dead. That's what I'd been told since I was 6. But this letter was real, and it was in my hands. I didn't know what to think. I sat on my bed, staring at the paper until it was too dark to see. My aunt and uncle were downstairs, watching TV like nothing had happened. I didn't tell them about the letter. I didn't trust them to explain anything. All I knew was that my life, or what I thought I knew about it, was unraveling. I waited 2 days before calling the number. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe I was scared it was a mistake, or worse, some kind of cruel trick. But I couldn't ignore it. I sat in my room, door locked, and dialed. A man answered on the second ring. His voice was rough, like he'd been waiting for the call his whole life. I said my name, and there was a long pause. Then he started crying. Not loud, just quiet sobs that made my chest tighten. He said he was my father. He wasn't dead. He'd been alive all this time, searching for me. Then he told me something I wasn't ready for: my mother wasn't dead either. But she wasn't the person I thought she was. She had taken me away when I was 6, faked the crash, and built a new life somewhere else. He didn't know where we'd gone until now. My head was spinning. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. He told me he'd spent years trying to find me, that he never believed I was gone. The letter, he said, was the first real lead he'd had in a decade. I didn't ask many questions. I couldn't. It was too much. When the call ended, he asked me to meet him. I said I'd think about it. After I hung up, I sat there for hours, trying to piece together what was real. My mother had lied. My father had never stopped looking. And I had no idea who I was anymore. The call with my father left me reeling, but it also filled in gaps I'd never understood. He explained what happened when I was 6. My parents' marriage had been falling apart for years. They fought constantly, mostly about money and custody. My mother didn't want to lose me in a divorce, so she made a drastic choice. She told my father she was taking me on a short trip, just the two of us. Instead, she staged a car crash. She used fake documents to make it look like we both died. She changed our names, moved us to a new state, and cut off all contact with anyone from our old life. My father was left with nothing but a police report and a burned-out car. He didn't believe it. He knew something was wrong, but the authorities had no leads. My mother had planned it too well. She created a new identity for herself, and enrolled me in a new school under a different name. The relatives who took me in, my aunt and uncle, were part of her plan. They were paid to keep quiet and raise me, to make sure nobody asked questions. I was too young to understand, and by the time I was old enough to question things, the story of the crash was all I knew. My father spent years trying to find us. He went to the police, hired private investigators, and even reached out to distant family members, but my mother had covered her tracks. She made sure we vanished. I sat with this information for days, trying to make sense of it. My entire childhood was built on a lie. My mother hadn't just taken me away, she'd stolen my life, my father, everything. I didn't know whether to be angry or heartbroken. All I knew was that the woman I'd mourned for a decade wasn't who I thought she was. The letter from my mother wasn't just a confession, it was her way of unburdening herself. My father told me she was sick, terminally ill with only months left. That's why she wrote. She couldn't face dying with the weight of what she'd done. She'd been watching me from a distance, keeping tabs through people I'd never suspected. She knew I was living with my aunt and uncle, knew I'd grown up thinking she was dead. But she never reached out until now. Her letter didn't apologize, not directly. It just laid out the truth and pointed me to my father. I didn't know how to feel about her. Part of me wanted to find her, to ask why she did it, but another part couldn't stomach the thought of facing her. My father, though, was different. He'd spent 10 years searching for me. He filed missing persons reports every year, even when the police told him to move on. He posted on forums, contacted journalists, and followed every lead, no matter how small. He sold his car to pay for one investigator, then took out loans for another. He never stopped believing I was out there. When I called him, he already knew it was me before I said my name. He'd been waiting for that moment for a decade. I learned he still lived in the same house we'd shared when I was a kid. He hadn't changed a thing, not even my old bedroom. He kept every toy, every book, every piece of me he could hold on to. Knowing that broke something in me. I'd spent so long feeling like nobody cared, like I was a burden to everyone. But my father had never given up. I decided I had to meet him. Not because I was ready, but because I owed it to him, and maybe to myself. I booked a bus ticket for the next week. The whole time, I kept thinking about what I'd say, what he'd look like, and whether I'd even recognize him. I didn't know what came next, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The bus ride to my father's house took 6 hours. I spent the whole trip staring out the window, my stomach in knots. I hadn't told my aunt and uncle where I was going. I just packed a bag and left a note saying I'd be back in a few days. They didn't deserve more than that. The closer I got to my father's town, the more memories started coming back. Little things, like the smell of the pine trees near our old house or the sound of gravel under tires. When the bus pulled into the station, I saw him waiting. He was older than I remembered, with gray in his hair and lines on his face, but his eyes were the same. He recognized me the second I stepped off the bus. He didn't say anything at first, just walked over and hugged me. I stood there, stiff, not knowing how to react. He didn't let go for a long time. We drove to the house in his truck, the same one he'd had when I was a kid. The town hadn't changed much. The diner on the corner was still there, the park with the rusted swings, the blue shutters on our house. Inside, it was like stepping into a time capsule. My drawings were still pinned to the fridge, my old sneakers by the door. He showed me my room, untouched since I was 6. The bed was made, the stuffed animals lined up on the shelf. He'd kept it all, waiting for me to come back. We spent the day going through photos and papers. He had boxes of them, every moment of my early life he could save. He never remarried, never left the house, because he couldn't bear the thought of me coming back and finding him gone. I stayed for 3 days, learning who he was, who I'd been. It wasn't easy. There were gaps we couldn't fill, years we'd never get back. But being there, in that house, with him, felt like the first real thing in a long time.